A very good evening and welcome to Vantage Point on Newsfirst. There's been a lot of significant developments in the Sri Lankan political arena with the visit of a very key or very high-profile diplomat to the country and what transpired following that visit, and also the UWA Provincial Council elections, which are to be held most probably in September, and also in the international arena, the deaths and the number of air strikes that have been launched on the Gaza Strip. To talk about all of these and much more, I have with me today on Vantage Point Dr. Diane Jayathilaka, a former permanent mission to Sri Lanka to the UN. A very good evening, Doctor. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening, Mahina.
Doctor, let's start off with the visit of this high-profile diplomat from South Africa. It stemmed from the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting where President Mahinda Rajapaksa made a request from South African President Jacob Zuma to assist in Sri Lanka's reconciliation process. And this led to the appointment by Jacob Zuma of the Deputy President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, who was named as the Sri Lankan Special Envoy to Sri Lanka and to Sudan. Now, Cyril Ramaphosa arrived in the island just last week, and he held discussions with the President, with the TNA, even with the opposition leader Ranil Wickremesinghe. However, there was a lot of sort of talk about what was really discussed. Let's start off with the reason why Cyril Ramaphosa arrived at Sri Lanka. It was said that he arrived to really listen to the Sri Lankan parties involved in the ethnic issue, and also to share views, the mutual sharing of views. What do you make of this trip of Cyril Ramaphosa?
Well, Mahina, the visit is the result of two, not one, two processes. As you said, President Mahinda Rajapaksa made a suggestion, we might even call it a request, of President Zuma during the bilateral discussion on the sidelines of the Commonwealth Heads of Government Summit. Now, you would recall that Prime Minister David Cameron of Britain was going hammer and tongs at Sri Lanka on that visit. And President Rajapaksa spoke to Jacob Zuma as a friend, and he said, look, the whole war crimes inquiry is going to be very counterproductive, polarizing. We know that South Africa had a different approach, and we'd like to share your experiences, and maybe you can help us. Perhaps we can announce an initiative modeled on the South African experience, and you can help us. Now, President Zuma took that very seriously. I think President Rajapaksa was right to reach out to Jacob Zuma. But I'm not so convinced about what happened when Cyril Ramaphosa actually came, but let's get to that. So, President Zuma's response on behalf of South Africa was, yes, we do have this experience which is very different from an intrusive international inquiry, truth and reconciliation, but our truth and reconciliation process did not precede political discussions on a new South Africa. It's because we sat down with our former enemies and we talked and we arrived at a consensus as to how the new South Africa should be, that we were able then to come up with the truth and reconciliation mechanism as a byproduct of that larger discussion. So that is our real experience, and you can't really take the TRC out without a broader discussion. Now, I said that there were two processes, Maina. What very few people know is that South Africa has been engaged in the search for conflict resolution and conflict transformation in Sri Lanka for about, I would say, a little under 15 years. I remember because I was present at discussions way back when this got rolling. Now, the key personality in that effort was a member of the delegation that came this time, and that is Ibrahim, who is now the advisor to the president, but that's not all he was. Ibrahim was a very important political militant of the African National Congress, and he spent 13 years on Robben Island with Nelson Mandela as a political prisoner. He was the head of the intelligence wing of the African National Congress when it was a liberation movement. Now, after South Africa became free, Ibrahim was a powerful parliamentarian, senator. He headed the Senate oversight on intelligence. So he's a veteran ANC upper echelon personality. He was the man who used to come in to Sri Lanka and meet people across the political spectrum way back in, I think, 2001, 2002. I recall those meetings because Foreign Minister Lakshman Kadirgama made sure that I was present at some of the meetings. Now, Ibrahim used to come with another person, and that other person, who was also very important, was also a member of this delegation this time, and that is Rolf Meyer. Now, Rolf Meyer was on the other side of the ANC, was an enemy. Rolf Meyer was the defense minister, the last defense minister of white apartheid South Africa. So the two negotiators were, Ramaphosa on one side, we'll get to that, but Rolf Meyer was the key negotiator on the South African apartheid regime side. It tells you what kind of miracle the South Africans have achieved, that after that these former enemies worked together as part of the new South Africa. Now those two, Ibrahim and Rolf Meyer, have been coming and going to Sri Lanka for 10 to 15 years, more than 10 years. Now,
and in what capacity have they been working with Sri Lanka? What has been their role during all these years? Not this particular visit, but when you were working with them, what was their capacity of duty here?
Well, when Nelson Mandela was the president of South Africa, President Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumaratunga and Foreign Minister Lakshman Kadirgama met him officially and unofficially. Nelson Mandela was very happy with President Kumaratunga because of Mrs. Bandaranaike, the memory of Mrs. Bandaranaike. So the Non-Aligned Summit conference was held in South Africa. Sri Lanka attended that. And then the Sri Lankan leadership sensed that there had been some infiltration through the Tamil diaspora of pro-LTT propaganda, which had influenced even the South African leadership, and they spoke to Nelson Mandela about it. And of course Nelson Mandela understood, and he said, yeah, you know, there are some speech writers, somebody tried to slip something in my speech and so on. And it was after that that South Africa, the ANC, decided, okay, let's, since there are concerns in South Africa, especially Durban, from the Tamil community there, let's send some top people to Sri Lanka to see whether this can be resolved at all. So Ibrahim used to come here with Rolf Mayer. They met the LTT, but he was never pro-LTT, and met everybody on the political spectrum. So this is a long and old process. It's on mediation, but it's unusual. It wasn't unhelpful. It was good. Now, President Rajapaksa's request to President Zuma was only the latest in the Sri Lankan-South African interaction. South Africa supported Sri Lanka very strongly in May 2009 in Geneva. When I served in Geneva, there was a vote on Sri Lanka which we won. South Africa was, crucial supporter and player. I remember the ambassador, a lady doctor, Machali, that was her surname. She was an ANC person. So from that time, when I was serving there has been a change in the South African position. South Africa has never voted against Sri Lanka.
And even at the previous election, they abstained from voting.
But they shifted from voting for us to a position of abstention. So now we have several friendly neutrals. Unfortunately, these were all people who voted for us. But India, South Africa, they moved to a position on the fence, which also enables them to talk to the TNA. Because if they were seen as supporters of the Sri Lankan government, then they can't talk to the TNA. But if they were seen to have voted against Sri Lanka, they can't talk to the government. But these are influential powers that are in the intermediate zone. So they're trying to help Sri Lanka in the way that Sri Lanka wants, the government wants, but also in what they are concerned about, which is political reconciliation between the Sinhalese and the Tamils, between the government and the TNA, the South and the North, call it what you will. And that would help them because there are concerns, there are lobbies and pressure groups within the ANC itself. So it's these two processes, the old long-term process of Ibrahim and Rolf Mayer coming over here, that is what is known as the backstory. And then you have President Rajapaksa's interaction with President Jacob Zuma and this very significant appointment of Cyril Ramaphosa. Now, Cyril Ramaphosa is a very important man. Many years ago, when Nelson Mandela was still in jail and the white apartheid regime was suppressing the people of South Africa, a young man, educated young man, Cyril Ramaphosa, decided that the only thing that could change it was not so much the street demonstrations, but if the white South African economic prosperity were affected. And the way to do that was to organize the black working class. So what did he do? He did something very difficult, Mahina. He became a mine worker. He went down into the gold mines, into the diamond mines. He worked there and he formed a very strong organization called the National Union of Mine Workers. The NUM became a very powerful force which was able to cripple the economy of white South Africa. So that is what helped the ANC turn the tables on the white government, because whatever else happened, so long as the money was okay, the regime was okay. But when the economy was hit by the strikes by the black workers in the gold and diamond mines, then the game started changing. Now, when it came to the issue of the release of Nelson Mandela, the man who led the negotiations was young Cyril Ramaphosa. He successfully negotiated the release of Nelson Mandela. And there's a reference to him in Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom. Now, after that, everybody thought that Cyril Ramaphosa was going to be the next president after Mandela. He was Mandela's right hand. But he had other ideas. Cyril Ramaphosa, this just tells you what kind of guy he is. He thought, okay, now we've got freedom, we've got the vote, we've got a new constitution, but what we don't have is economic power as the black majority. Now either we can do what Zimbabwe did, that is go and grab all the white properties and the white farms and chase out white people. And if we do that, there will be economic collapse, and it won't be good for the whites or the blacks. Then what do we do? He thought, no, what we need is a black capitalist class, which is able to compete with the white capitalist class, and which is able to compete globally. So this man who had become a mine worker then decided to become a capitalist. And he was as successful at that as he was as a trade unionist. So he became a multi-billionaire and helped build a sophisticated black entrepreneurial class. Having done that, he came back into politics. And now he is the deputy of the ANC and the deputy president of South Africa. Someday, in a few years, he will almost certainly be elected the president of South Africa. Now, he is the man who President Jacob Zuma appointed as his special envoy on peace and reconciliation in Sri Lanka. Not on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission only, but on peace and political reconciliation in Sri Lanka. And President Zuma announced this in a speech that he made, a presidential speech. So this is a very important player. It shows the importance that South Africa has attached to this. This man is a very important political figure in the whole of Africa. I really hope that the government of Sri Lanka hasn't messed up this visit, because the consequences would be quite negative for us if they have.
Information about the dialogues, the one-on-one dialogues that Ramaphosa had with President Rajapaksa have not really made it into the media. There's not much said about the visit. Even about the visit itself, there was a lot of contradictory views. The cabinet media spokesperson said that Ramaphosa was here as a tourist, but Newmal, who is the Deputy Minister of External Affairs, Newmal Pereira, said that he was here mainly to help in the reconciliation process of Sri Lanka. Why is there such contradictory views about such a high-profile figure visiting Sri Lanka?
Well, Mahina, a few weeks ago, one of the constituent parties of the government, a small party led by Mr. Vimal Weerawansa, I think it's called the National Freedom Front, NFF, had a convention and it issued a 12-point platform. Understandable, no problem, They criticized Dr. P.B. Jasundara, business as usual. I mean, elections are coming, everybody wants to negotiate the best possible deal with the government. But what was serious about the NFF's 12-point platform is that there was an explicit criticism of the South African initiative, which was really a Sri Lankan initiative, but anyway. They opposed any role of facilitation, still less mediation, being played by South Africa. They were very critical of the Ramaphosa visit. They were followed by the JHU, the Jatika Hela Urumaya, of Minister Champika Ranawaka. And then there were the usual suspects, Dr. Gunadas Amarasekara and so on. These are sort of singular hardliners who are attached either to or sympathetic to either the NFF or the JHU or shared by both. And they were very critical of South Africa. So, I believe that it is this criticism that made Kelly Rambukwella say what he said, which wasn't a smart thing to say. But I think that was the context, and it is possible for us to legitimately speculate as to whether Vimal Veeravansa and Champika Ranamaka's opposition to the South African role or the South African factor was in fact a proxy for some other more powerful hard line elements within the power elite, within the power structure, because I have noticed a pattern that whenever President Rajapaksa reaches out to somebody, it could be India, it could be Japan, it could be South Africa, or those countries reach out to him and he agrees, either he requests or he agrees to some kind of initiative which can unfreeze this situation, then within days or weeks the same guys start criticizing it. I mean, it's been happening for a couple of years now, I would say in the entire post-war period. Whenever there's an attempt by the president or an agreement by the president to unfreeze the situation, then certain hardline elements start using these little parties and try to preempt any opening up of space, any reform, any relaxation. And I think that's what happened. And that is probably why Kelly Rambukwella was off balance. And he said he's coming as a tourist. Now obviously tourists don't get to have dinner with the president one-on-one unless they are the 10 million tourists and part of the ticket is dinner with the president. I don't think that's what it was this time. So one mustn't look foolish and one mustn't take other people for fools. That is not the way to treat an important figure like Cyril Ramaphosa. It's bad for the country. It doesn't do us any good. It also helped the TNA to present a much better image than the Sri Lankan government.
And coming to that now, one of the main areas the Sri Lankan government said that was going to be focused during this visit was the mutual sharing of views. And we don't really know what views were shared between the Sri Lankan government and Cyril Ramaphosa, but the Tamil National Alliance, as you said, was very vocal about the discussions it held. And I'll just quote some of what the parliamentarians from the TNA said. MP Sumanthiran said that the TNA has extended support to the efforts of Ramaphosa and to take the process of political reconciliation forward in a constructive way and to look forward to South Africa's continuing constructive engagement with Sri Lanka. R. Sambandhan, following the visit of the South African Special Envoy, said a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, if at all, would be the last thing in the dialogue. It would be the final component.
Yeah.
But the Sri Lankan government was harping on the fact that Cyril Ramaphosa was here to really share experiences of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa. What have you got to say about the views expressed by the TNA?
Well, it looks to me, I mean, the TNA, I don't agree with what, for instance, Chief Minister Vigneswaran told Cyril Ramaphosa, at least according to what Chief Minister Vigneswaran said at the media conference. I mean, it was not exactly a moderate point of view. But still, for all, when I look at it, I think that the government had a golden opportunity, but I don't think it's made full use of it. And I think the TNA made better use of it than the government. And overall, I think the TNA have been better diplomats than the Sri Lankan government, going by the coverage I have of the Ramaphosa visit. Now, we will see the outcome when we read about what Cyril Ramaphosa said back in South Africa. That story is going to leak from the South African end. And eventually Cyril Ramaphosa will play a role. He'll say something about Sri Lanka, I hope it's not at the high-level segment in Geneva next year, the UNHRC, and I hope it's not critical of Sri Lanka, because what is important is that Sri Lanka is under pressure on its western front. It's also it's under pressure from the Tamil Nadu front. On the western front, you have a very serious international inquiry headed up by a former president of Finland, Martti Ahtisaari, and having Sylvia Cartwright and Asma Jahangir as members. So it's a serious issue. It's a threat to Sri Lanka's sovereignty. Now, Sri Lanka needs influential friends at a moment like this. It needs buffer states. South Africa has moved from an ally to a buffer state. Japan has been a friend but has always been a buffer because it has its relationships with the United States, but it has never voted against Sri Lanka. India is an ally who has also become a buffer state. Now, we need these buffer states. If the buffer states move away from us, then we are vulnerable. We are wide open. It is important that Cyril Ramaphosa feels that the government of Sri Lanka is flexible and is sincere in its intention to have a political dialogue with the democratic representatives of the Tamil people. Now, I don't know whether he has got that impression. Now, this is a very experienced man. He's very experienced in negotiation. You can't fool him. If he left Sri Lanka with the impression that neither side is authentically flexible and open-minded, or that one side is more rational, more reasonable than the other, and if he thinks that that's not the government of Sri Lanka but the TNA, then Sri Lanka is in trouble, because we cannot afford to lose the trust and goodwill of a personality as important as Ramaphosa and a country as important as South Africa. Because the BRICS, which as you know consists of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, are crucial players in the world system. Back in 2009, we had the solid support of the BRICS in Geneva when I served there. But that's been breaking up. Brazil now votes against us. India abstains, having voted against us before. South Africa voted for us and now abstains. And that leaves Russia and China solid supporters. But finally, if it's a choice between their partners in BRICS, Russia's arms market in India, at the political weight of Brazil, South Africa and so on, Russia and China are not going to keep on supporting little Sri Lanka. If their friends in the BRICS say, look, these guys are difficult. Russia and China will support us against the West, but they won't support us if their friends in BRICS start backing away from Sri Lanka. So this was a very crucial visit, and I am not convinced that the government of Sri Lanka did not drop the catch. I think the catch was dropped.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission is at the center of this visit, according to the Sri Lankan government.
According to the Sri Lankan government?
Yes.
Not according to the South Africans.
But is this a way of the Sri Lankan government really buying time when it comes to dealing with the international pressures on it? Is it a way of showing to the international community in the wake of this investigation by the UNHRC that Sri Lanka is doing something, that the Sri Lankans are very much into reconciliation and is seeking South Africa's assistance to it? But on the other hand, we have a LLRC, the Lessons Learned in Reconciliation Commission, which was formed on international best practices. So does this mean that the Sri Lankan government had not analyzed the TRC when it compiled the LLRC?
Well, it's perfectly legitimate for the Sri Lankan government to seek a mechanism such as the TRC, the South African TRC, as a counter to the UN international inquiry. But then, it has to go all the way. All the way means that if you want the South Africans to give you a certificate and say, look, we're working together on a TRC type of thing, which is not punitive, and South Africa is helping us. Frankly, if you want to use the South Africans as a human shield, you don't get to do it for free. You need to pay a political price. The political price is that the South Africans are saying, hey, we are not going to give you a free pass. You can't use our logo unless there's something in it for us. And what we want is to see the Sinhalese and the Tamil leaderships engaging in political reconciliation through dialogue. Because we are under pressure from opinion sectors in the ANC and outside. So, if you start talking to the TNA, and we are willing to help you, we are willing to get the two of you guys together, then if that works, your problems are almost solved, because then we'll go out and tell the world that you are sincere, you're talking to the TNA, and to hold off on this international inquiry because it's not even helpful. And the Indians will support you on that, or support us.
But the critics of the government have said that, Ramaphosa was brought in to also persuade the TNA to basically engage or participate in the Parliamentary Select Committee that was set up to find a durable solution to the ethnic conflict, to the ethnic crisis. Do you see that happening? Do you see that Ramaphosa really persuading the TNA to get involved in the PSA when the TNA has said that it's...
Well, why in the first place, Ramaphosa is not, he's not he doesn't play the role of a consultant hired by the Sri Lankan government to con the TNA into coming into the PSC. The PSC discredited itself by the way in which it behaved in relation to Shirani Bandaranaike. Now, if the government wanted to get the TNA into the PSC, then it should have got the PSC to behave differently on the matter of Shirani Bandaranaike. They could have gone ahead with the impeachment, but they could have conducted themselves differently. Once the PSC has discredited itself by behaving like a steamroller, even concerning a singular Buddhist woman, academic, who was the Chief Justice appointed by the President, then you don't expect a minority party to go and put its head on the same rail track. Now, Cyril Ramaphosa probably wasn't able to bring the TNA into the PSC. But we have to understand the TNA can afford to sit it out. Nobody is having a war crimes inquiry against the TNA. The government of Sri Lanka needs the TNA to engage in a political dialogue. Why? Because there is an growing international encirclement. There is pressure which we cannot really withstand beyond a point as a small island on India's doorstep with a vulnerable economy. Because the economic factor is going to kick in the moment the Marthi Athisari report is presented to the UNHRC in March 2015 in Geneva. So, the government thinks, okay, we can have our elections and we can win, but yes, they can. But that's not going to solve the crisis. So you need a political process to talk to the TNA, show the world there's a process going on, and therefore don't mess it up with this war crimes issue and polarize the situation. But if there is no process, then you don't have an argument to use to say, back off. And our friends, the South Africans, the Indians, the Japanese, don't have anything to to use in our defense. We don't have a shield then. So it is more important for the government to be seen to have a dialogue with the TNA than it is for the TNA to be seen to have a dialogue with the government. The TNA only has to look pretty. I mean, basically, the TNA only has to sound reasonable. And Vignesh didn't really sound reasonable, but they only have to sound more reasonable than the government. And that's not difficult to do, because the government either contradicts itself, or the bottom line is, are you willing to talk, if we can make it happen, and the government says, well, no, they have to go into the PSC. Now, one way of making the PSC work, one of the ideas that was floating around is that, all right, the TNA is worried about the built-in majority for the government in the PSC, especially after the Shirani Bandaranaike experience. And from what I have been able to gather, one of the ideas that had come up from our friends in the international arena is, all right, is the government willing to make consensus rather than majority vote the principle of operation in a PSC process?
And that is why it's not just the TNA, but even the UMP, the JVP and other opposition parties feel that they have no confidence in the
Absolutely.
PSC.
I mean, the government has been unable. What's the point in telling Cyril Ramaphosa the TNA has to come into the PSC when the other southern opposition parties don't trust the PSC? And the government first has to convince the southern opposition to participate in the PSC. They don't want to, because they don't trust the government because of the way in which the government behaves. And why does the government behave that way? Who behaved that way in the PSC? Vimal Veeravansa in the Shirani Bandaranaike case, the PSC. I mean, so who wants to come into that PSC? Not even the UNP, not the JVP. There is no faith in that, and it is the government that needs to show the world that there is a dialogue. But what has happened, Mahina, finally we have to look at, I must say, I mean, I must be fair with the government. I read something very interesting in the political column of the Sunday Times, which is Colombo, which is a paper that is, I would say, more sympathetic to the UNP than it is certainly to the government. So I would take seriously what it discloses about the UNP. Now, the political column of the Sunday Times said that when Cyril Ramaphosa met the leader of the opposition told Cyril Ramaphosa that South Africa must not do anything which would disturb the Geneva process. And the next sentence of the Sunday Times political column is by which he meant the international inquiry on war crimes. So, I mean, frankly, I think this is really weird when the leader of the opposition, who is the leader of the main opposition party and who intends to be the presidential candidate, actually tells the visiting South African dignitary, look, there is a war crimes inquiry going on in Geneva, don't do anything, South Africa must not do anything to help Sri Lanka get away from that. Now, that is not a responsible or patriotic stand to take. Now, if the government newspaper said it, I would have said, nonsense, this is just propaganda. But when I read it in the Sunday Times, then, I don't know whether to laugh or cry. So we have this strange situation in which the opposition or the main opposition party does not behave responsibly concerning the Ramaphosa visit, and the government has not acted in its own best interests, which is really to make Cyril Ramaphosa their new best friend. I mean, we need Ramaphosa more than Ramaphosa needs us. He doesn't need us. And the government should have made a better impression on Ramaphosa than the TNA, but I think for some strange reason, the political leadership is is more interested in not upsetting some Sinhalese hardliners
who feel that there's an international interference in Sri Lanka's
who feel
domestic
that
affairs.
you just should say no to everybody. Now, Mahina, when you are under serious pressure from the West, intrusive pressure which can damage your economy in 1 year, you need all the friends you can get. And it's fine to say no to the main danger, but you can't keep saying no to everybody on every front, on every issue. I mean, it may be great advice for a parent to give a young lady in her teens who's going out, to a disco. We know the old phrase, just say no. Now that's fine, but not in foreign policy. In foreign policy, in a country's relations with the world, you can't just say no to everything and anything that everybody suggests, especially when these are your friends. Because finally you won't have any friends when the bad guys come for you. And that is the situation that Sri Lanka is getting into. Now, I am not happy at all. In fact, I'm very apprehensive about the move that the government had just made, which is the reappointment of General Chandrasiri, former General Chandrasiri, as the governor of the northern province for another 5-year term. Now, he's a fine soldier, a fine officer, very good track record. But you shouldn't have a military governor, or rather an ex-military governor, which is the closest thing we can get to a military governor, in the northern province or any province whatsoever. In Pakistan, even with a military administration at one time, I mean, I've been to Pakistan, the governors of provinces were not ex-military men, they were civilian politicians. I've met some of them. You don't have military or ex-military governors. Okay, during wartime, fine. There was after the war, okay, there was a period of transition. You have a Northern Provincial Council elected. You should have had a new governor, but all right, there was a term, General Chandrasiri's term needed to be completed. But once that was over, when you make this reappointment, Mahina, what is the signal you're giving South Africa, India, Japan? I'm just talking about our friends who have been trying to help us in the international arena. You weaken the people who are willing to speak on your behalf. Because you've got to give your friends something so that they can help you. And give them something to work with. This is just the opposite of giving them something to work with. You don't the government doesn't restart the negotiations with the TNA, doesn't use Ramaphosa to do that job.
But it has also reached out to India, according to media reports, where the Foreign Minister, G.L. Peiris, has visited India and met with the Indian External Affairs Minister and asked her as well and India to support the TNA in joining the PSC.
The Indian side has not said yes to that at all. It hasn't said no, it hasn't said yes. And from what we know, Prime Minister Modi told President Rajapaksa, India wants Sri Lanka to expeditiously implement the 13th Amendment and resume a political dialogue with the TNA. Now, it's very dangerous to send a man like Ramaphosa empty-handed from Sri Lanka or with a bad impression. I don't see any breakthrough. We should have let him make a breakthrough, so then, it's good for him. It's good for us. And then he would talk on our behalf because the breakthrough would mean an achievement on his part. But we've sent him away empty-handed, and if the government is happy about it, I wonder why it's happy. Because there's no reason to be happy about it. And the signal that we have given with the issue of the northern governor is not going to help us get out of a very difficult external situation.
Well, with that, we're going for a short commercial break. When we come back, we'll be talking about the upcoming elections and also the atrocities that's happening in the Gaza Strip. Stay with us. Welcome back to Vantage Point. We're in conversation with Dr. Dayan Jayathilaka. We spoke about the visit of the Deputy President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa. Let's now move on to another news story that's making the headline, Doctor, and that is the relationship between the NGOs and the media. Now, the government the government says that a circular it issued a circular by the National Secretariat for NGOs stating that the NGO should not have media workshops, should not have training for journalists, should not have press conferences. What do you make of this circular?
Well, Mahina, I mean, in the first place, why should there be an NGO secretariat in the Ministry of Defense? I can understand in the Ministry of, I don't know, local government, social services, maybe even the foreign ministry, if they're worried about sovereignty implications. I mean, if that's it, there's foreign funding or whatever. But what's it doing in the Ministry of Defense? That's point one. Point two, many Asian countries have a vibrant NGO community. I mean, look at Bangladesh. It's chock full of NGOs. And the NGOs, I don't agree with everything that every NGO says. I mean, I think that on the war, some NGOs took entirely the wrong position, but that is something you debate in the newspapers or you criticize politically. You don't have to suffocate them. And there's a lot of good work that the NGOs did immediately after the tsunami. We wouldn't have got out of this situation as fast as we did if the NGOs and local and foreign and the government didn't work together or in parallel to help restore normalcy. Now, why pick this fight with the NGOs now, Mahina? I mean, what's going wrong? What's happening here? Because, as I said, you have a serious threat on the western flank, as manifested in the UN international inquiry. That's only the most visible manifestation, but there's a lot of pressure building up on the western flank. You have Tamil Nadu and its chief minister calling for an international referendum on Tamilila. Now, why would anybody want to create a third and a fourth front? The third front is this religious thing, where our solid allies, the OIC, the Organization of the Islamic Conference, Arab and non-Arab Islamic countries, would be confused as to what's happening in Sri Lanka when Islamophobia, incitement against Muslims, is permitted and violence results in which the victims are all Muslim with one Tamil, and there's no crackdown. So you have another front. You have people calling for the Pope to apologize a few months from a papal visit. Now, the failure of the government to prevent or to punish the perpetrators of Alutkama led to perhaps the most respected Buddhist personality on the planet, the Dalai Lama, to criticize singular Buddhist extremist organizations in Sri Lanka and Buddhist extremist organizations in Burma, Myanmar, for their Islamophobic violence. And now there are those who are criticizing the Pope. Now, on top of all of that, you open a new front by putting pressure on the NGOs. So Sri Lanka looks like a state that's not reconciling with the minorities, and that's also trying to suffocate the freedom of association and activity, of voluntary activity. Now, are we a society in which, as citizens, free citizens, we can cooperate with each other on a voluntary basis and engage in activities on matters that we are concerned about, so long as we stay within the Constitution and the law? Or are we a society in which everything is viewed through the lens of security and people are increasingly restricted? Civic associations, social freedom is increasingly regulated and restricted and squeezed. Which of these two are we? It is far easier, and as a diplomat who successfully defended Sri Lanka in the international arena, I can say that it's far easier to defend a country which is a free and democratic country. You can defend the sovereignty of Sri Lanka more successfully if you can credibly say that this is a functioning democracy, not only because of the elections that we have, but also because you have a free society. You have free civic associations engaged in voluntary activity. It's far easier to do that. It's very difficult to defend the sovereignty of a country that is seen to be more restrictive, that is not free, that is seen as authoritarian. Now, all the countries that have lost their sovereignty, take all the countries, none of them are open, free democracies. I mean, Libya, Iraq, I am opposed to what was done to them. But it was easy to do that because these are seen as some kind of closed societies. If your society is a closed society, it's very difficult to defend sovereignty. And with this move on the NGOs, you're giving the impression of a society that is increasingly being closed. And that is not helpful to us, especially when we are facing a threat to our national sovereignty internationally. So I think it's a very stupid move.
Because the government actually said that, or the Prime Minister, D.M. Jayaratne, said that NGOs act in a manner that threaten national security, according to media reports. How is this possible?
So then there should be evidence. And if the NGOs, I read that the Prime Minister said the NGOs have given weapons to the LTT. I didn't know that the LTT needed weapons from NGOs. But if that's true, why now, 5 years after the war? I mean, we should have known it then. We should have been told all of it then. Is it that the NGOs broke the blockade, the cover story of what was happening in Arutgama and told the truth? And is that why there is an attempt now to try to cut them off and to choke off the information flow to the outside world?
Well, Doctor, we're running out of time on the show, so let's just quickly go on to the UWA Provincial Council elections. Let me just talk to you a little bit about the JVP, who are one of the first political parties to have really named a nomination board and really gear up for the UWA Provincial Council elections. Now, the JVP has said that it has nominated actually Samantha Vidyaratne as its group leader, and it has a strong nomination board which consists of Tilvin Silva, K.D. Lalkantha, Sunil Handuneti, and of course Vijita Herath. So the JVP really looks like it's one of the parties who are really geared for the UWA Provincial Council elections, which are to be held in September, as reports suggest. But the SLFP, the UPFA, the UMP have not really said anything about their nominations. What do you make of this JVP's start for the UWA Provincial Council elections?
Well, Mahina, I mean, whether it's that television program on which there were fisticuffs, or whether it's the parliament, what I see is that the only party which is functioning in a responsible, rational and transparent manner is the JVP. I mean, if you vote for the government, you're voting for the status quo, and if you're happy with the status quo, that's fine. If you're not happy with the status quo, then you shouldn't vote for the government. Now, if you vote for the main opposition party, I mean, you really don't know whether those people are going to wind up on the side of the government. So, you know, I mean, what's the point? It doesn't make much sense to me. If you take the UWA election, though, I must say that the personality who has put himself forward as the UNP's challenger to Shashindra Rajapaksa should have known better in the way in which he behaved. Now, I'm not saying that Dayasa Wijasekara behaved well, But Dasari Jayasekara can afford to behave badly. He's already the chief minister. It's like somebody who's passed an exam and then goes, say, a law exam and then messes up a court case, but the man is at least a lawyer. And somebody else who has yet to sit an exam behaving stupidly. So, Shashindra Rajapaksa has so far conducted himself over the years in a very responsible and decent manner in terms of his public political behavior, as far as I have been able to see. I've not seen him brawling or speaking angrily he's not like he doesn't behave like a schoolboy during the intermission. So he's, if you look at the two major parties, I think right now the UNP's chief ministerial candidate did himself a disservice in relation to the behavior that we see Shashindra having engaged in. Shashindra is not a discredit to his party and his family, that family that he belongs to. But if you're talking about politics in general, there seems to be a deadlock in the UNP, even a decomposition. And the only growing force which is articulating the grievances of the people and speaking responsibly, whether it's on television or in the parliament, is the JVP. And since people have only their vote, that's all the citizens of this country have, one has to invest that vote wisely. So, the choice to me right now looks like, do you vote for Shashindra if you think that, it's good for the province, or if you want to send a message and you want to have representatives in the provincial council who will speak for the people, then that's the JVP. That's the way it looks to me. And analysts have to view the UA provincial council election as differently from all the other provincial elections. Why? Not because it's UA, but because this looks very much like the doorstep to the presidential and parliamentary elections. So, UA must not be taken in isolation. UA must be taken as the first of three elections moving up. UA, presidential, parliamentary. I doubt the government is going to give much of a gap, much breathing space to the opposition to recover after UA. They will go for the presidential and parliamentary as quickly as the law permits them. So UA is very crucial. If the UNP has not recovered from its 20-something% in UA, then unless it makes a drastic leadership change before the presidential election, I think, it can kiss that election goodbye.
Well, Doctor, let's now move to international politics and international affairs. The story that's making it into the news these days in all channels across the international media and even in media here at home is the airstrikes on Gaza. According to international reports, over 170 people have been killed and 77% of these are actually civilians and mostly women and children. Now, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he's sorry for the accidental civilian deaths, but he says that the Hamas has to bear complete responsibility for these airstrikes. But some may say that this statement may actually not help in really disbanding Hamas as an organization, because as much as Israel strikes Gaza, there's a lot of sort of sympathy towards Gaza, the Palestinians, and also a sort of popularity boost for the Hamas. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, one has to go by facts. The facts are that Israeli civilian casualties are zero. Because the Israelis have protection against these homemade rockets. I mean, these rockets don't really kill anybody. It's a sign of desperation. Of course, no country can allow rockets to be fired at its citizens, and it has a right, Israel has a right to retaliate. But, as everybody's preaching to Sri Lanka, I mean, in our case, it wasn't a question of zero casualties. In the Israeli case, the American Iron Dome has enabled them to have zero casualties. And therefore the retaliation should have been proportionate. You don't use your air force in the most densely populated area in the world, by the way, Gaza, because it's packed tight. The people can't escape. The Rafah crossing is open only for dual citizens and certain very selected categories into Egypt. So they're boxed in, and most of the casualties have been civilians, as you said, and we can see it. And there are, kids, babies. They even hit, the Israeli airstrikes hit a hospital for the disabled. Now I've heard of disabling terrorism, but that doesn't mean you bomb the hospital for the disabled. And these are the Israelis we're talking about. They know every inch of that place. They have the technology, they have the satellites, they have the drones, they've got it all wrapped up. This is just carnage. I mean, it's taking place before the eyes of the world. The question is, where are all those people who are howling about Sri Lanka? Where's David Cameron? Where's everybody else? The ones who are accusing Sri Lanka. That is why, Mahina, I say that there are dual standards that Sri Lanka must not compromise on this hypocritical call for an international inquiry. Because let those guys go and check out the Israelis first. It's taking place before our eyes.
And the Israelis says that
and this is during Ramadan.
And there's no end in sight for this conflict.
This is during it's during the month of Ramadan. That's the worst thing. I'm not saying the Israelis shouldn't retaliate. They have the capacity for very selective retaliation. And as I said, there's nobody dead on the Israeli side.
But there's also allegations that the Middle East is not doing enough to sort of address these airstrikes. Do you agree with that?
Well, what can the rest of the Middle East do? You can have a mass sort of manifestation, but still, let's take the facts, Mahina. It's now known, there's enough information, that the invasion of Iraq by George Bush was part of an American plan, a plan not by the Obama administration or the Democrats, but by the far right of the Republican administration. It was part of a plan to change the security environment of the Middle East so that Israel is safe. So Iraq was invaded. Now Iraq is being broken up. Libya was invaded.
And we see the ISIS now taking major control of cities in Iraq.
And Syria, there's a civil war in Syria. Fortunately, Assad has held on with the support of Russia and China. But the Middle East has been deliberately broken up. The states have been broken up. That's what happens. That's what happens when a state is broken up by external forces, which is something we must never allow. Never allow in Sri Lanka. Because it's easy to say, yeah, look at these dictators and this and that, and then, you bring in the foreigners, and they come in and they break up your state. Because the moment you break it up, then somebody wants to go independent. Look at the Kurds in Iraq. Now, they want to be independent. And they are almost independent. The country falls apart, then there are militia. So it's easy to target Gaza because everybody else is busy killing each other. If you had Gaddafi, if you had Saddam Hussein, that wouldn't happen. Now the only people who are there to resist are the Iranians, and it's because they helped Syria that this whole thing didn't work in Syria. But that is why the Saudis have been trying to hold back what they think is Iranian influence, and they've been supporting ISIS. Now, where are the American airstrikes against ISIS? There's more terrorism now. There's more Islamic quote-unquote terrorism now than there was before the Americans invaded Iraq and bombed Libya. So there you have it. The Israelis are safe. They can kill anybody they like because the Americans have weakened the Arab states, broken up the states.
Well, I'm afraid we'll have to conclude our program for today. Doctor, thank you very much for the insightful information that you've given on the headline-making news in Sri Lanka and across the world. And thank you very much for watching us. We'll see you again in a fortnight on Vantage Point. Take care and good night.